Hey, and look, people are showing up. We're seeing our audience arrive. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Andrew Fiala, and I am the director of the Ethics Center here at Fresno State. And we are so glad you're with us here on Zoom. And then I know we're going to have some folks on Facebook Live following us too. This is Virtual Reality Ethics Center, so welcome. Today's Constitution Day. It's the anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, and I checked the math. It was 233 years ago that this went down. So we can pride ourselves as Americans on this stable democracy for over a couple hundred years. We put this panel together, the Ethics Center working with the Department of Political Science, and Dr. Lisa Bryant, who's one of our speakers, she was really instrumental in making this happen. So thank you, Lisa. I'll introduce our speakers in just a minute. Just a couple of thank yous and updates about stuff. The Ethics Center lecture series is made possible by the Leon S. Peters Foundation, so we want to say thank you to them. We also want to thank the Department of Political Science for their collaboration on this. And then also I want to say thank you to Bell Vang, who is the engineer running the Facebook and in the background and did all the Zoom stuff. So Bell, thank you for your help with all of this and bringing this together. And then Bell is reminding me to tell everyone to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and all of that stuff. So we're Ethics Center's getting active out on social media, so you can follow our content out there. So we, Dr. Bryant and I, came up with the topic for our session today, focused on elections and democracy. And as you know, a bunch of election situations. So what we want to do in this discussion is model civil discourse and think critically, and we're going to try to avoid any kind of partisan, outrage sort of thing. This is really to try to build common ground and discover what we share in terms of values and think about how we can sustain and build our democracy. So just to sort of set the tone with that in mind, I want to name a couple of the topics we're hoping to talk about. Then I'm going to introduce our speakers and let them talk. So the topics will include the role of trust and civic virtue and participation in our democracy, issues about vote by mail and election security, concern fraud, voter suppression, and rigged elections, and then generally the role of elections in our democratic system. So in an hour, we'll see if we can talk about all those topics. We'll see where the conversation goes. Which reminds me, by the way, if you have questions or comments, if you're on Zoom or on Facebook, send them to the chat. So we'll monitor the chat as we go, and if appropriate in the middle, we'll break in with questions that come from the chat. At the end of the session, the last 10 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes, we'll have time for questions and comments that we're going to run through the chat function. Okay, so we have three great speakers with us. First, let me introduce Brandi Orth. Brandi Orth, I'm reading from my notes in case I'm looking down. Brandi Orth is the County Clerk and Registrar of Voters for Fresno County. She has served in that position since 2012, where she was initially appointed and then was elected in 2014 and 2018. She's been serving in county government for 26 years, 19 of those years working in the elections system. During her tenure, she's administered 32 elections, including presidential elections. She's currently president of the California Association of Clerks and Elected Officials. She has a Bachelor of Science degree and a business management and master's degree in public administration. And in 2019, she was honored by the Marjorie Mason Center as one of the top 10 professional women. So congratulations, Brandi, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
We also have with us Dr. Paul Gronke, who is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Early Voting Information Center at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Professor Gronke studies American politics, specializing in convenience and early voting, election administration, and public opinion. He previously served as editor of the Election Law Journal and is currently co-editor of PS, the Journal for Political Science and Politics. The Early Voting Information Center at Reed College searches for nonpartisan solutions to identified problems in election administration that are backed by solid empirical evidence. Professor Gronke was recently selected as a 2020 Andrew Carnegie Fellow to conduct research on stewards of democracy, looking at how election officials and local election administration can help offset declining faith and legitimacy in our system. Professor Gronke, thank you for joining us. You're muted actually, Paul.
There we go. Thank you, host. Thanks for having me.
Good. And then finally, Dr. Lisa Bryant is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science here at Fresno State. She's also the Survey Director for the Institute for Leadership and Public Policy. She has extensive research on voter mobilization, voter registration, voter confidence, and public opinion on fraud in elections and evaluations of local election officials, as well as a variety of other election-related projects. She currently serves on the Research Advisory Board for the Electronic Registration Information Center, which aims to ensure clean voter rolls and coordinate voter registration between the states. Lisa, I think I unmuted you too.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. So the first, just to throw a softball question, and then I'm gonna step out of the way and let you guys really talk this over and argue it through. You're the experts on this after all. So cool to have you with us. First topic of trust and civic virtue and participation. So just to frame that, I'm a philosopher, and we talk about dead people. So Plato was really suspicious of democracies. He thought they were kind of mob rule. But we've managed to hold our democracy together for a couple hundred years. And I think part of that longevity and that sustainability has to do with our faith in elections and our trust in the system. So let me ask, we start maybe with Professor Gronke, since you're our out-of-town guest. Do you want to give us some insight into the importance of trust and how the electoral system and all of that works in a democracy?
I can, and thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation. I'd like to start by expressing my just good thoughts for everyone in Fresno County and in your area of the country. We in Oregon now are experiencing what I know you guys experience seemingly every year. So I hope everyone's staying safe and that we get clear skies soon. So certainly, Andrew, it's interesting, elections in democracy in the United States, anyone who's taken Poli-Sci 101, I know Lisa has taught this same material in her classes. The founders were really skeptical in some respects about democracy and about elections. We have the French Revolution was an example that the founders looked at and were concerned. And many of the things that I think frustrate people today about American democracy, our decentralized system, our federalized system, powers that states have, are rooted in concerns that the founders had that some sort of direct democracy and direct mass opinion was a point of concern. Many of the reform efforts that have been put in place, both in the progressive era in the 1910s and 20s, and even today, are meant in some respects to address the indirect nature of American democracy. So of course, elections, Andrew, as a political philosopher, democracy, voice of the people, right? Elections are absolutely critical, but at the same time, in the United States, we have a representative democracy, an indirect democracy. And I think this often leads to frustrations among the citizenry because they'd like somehow their opinions to be translated more directly. They'd like our system to move more quickly. That's not really how we're set up.
Thanks, thanks, Paul. Brandi, do you want to come in on this issue about trust and democracy and offer a response?
Elections officials across the state really are boots on the ground. And we're the folks that exercise and implement the laws, in my case, in the state of California, and while doing it, being transparent and making sure that every eligible voter has an opportunity to participate. It's a very complicated process. It's got a lot of details to it. And one of my biggest jobs is just to educate the public about the process so that their ballots are counted. And in this current environment, as you know, there's a lot of rhetoric flying around out there that really isn't true. And so I always strongly recommend, if you're interested in learning the facts, then contact your local election official or go on our websites. And so hopefully today we'll talk a little bit about those very precise details so that no matter where you are, wherever you're joining us from, a lot of those details are kind of the same. And so we can help you participate in the process.
Lisa, how about what an opening comment from you?
I think that when we talk about trust, and I have a little bit of an advantage because my class talked about this last week, we think about civic participation and civic virtue and trust in government. And I think one of the questions we have to ask is, well, what do we really mean by trust in government? And you started this conversation with talking about, Plato not trusting mob mentality. I mean, James Madison didn't trust mob mentality either, right? And we have a system that's built in with sort of lots of safeguards to protect us against mob rule. And I think elections are key in a representative republic to ensuring that voices get heard, but that we don't have rule by a concentrated majority. I think, so I study participation and also election administration, and I think participation is key, and obviously it holds a very special place in my heart. My dissertation was all about how to get people to participate more and how to get more people to vote. I think this being Constitution Day, it's worth noting that your right to vote, which also is always an interesting question, right? Is voting a right or is voting a privilege? Voting as a right is mentioned in the Constitution 5 times. It's mentioned more than any other right that appears in the Constitution: free speech, free religion, anything, right? And so it's very much, I believe, fundamentally a right and important to our democracy. And I agree, I would like to reiterate, I think what Brandi said, our local election officials, and we're going to talk about election administration and trust in elections, especially in sort of an environment of misinformation. Our election officials, yes, call them and ask them about the process, but also one of the things I always say is get involved, right? Participation is key. And so sign up to be a poll worker and see how the process works, or sign up to be an election observer or unfold ballots, or, there's so many things that you can do to learn more about the process. And I think all of those roles are key to sort of understanding how elections work. But also they're another element of participation. They're another way that you can be involved to ensure the democratic process is working, and have a better understanding of how elections work.
So people can literally get involved and help count ballots. That may become surprising, especially to some college students that sort of picture that it's a mysterious, bureaucracy that takes care of this. How does it actually happen? How does it work? How are ballots counted and organized?
Okay, so let me do that. First off, thanks, Lisa. That was like a really good softball for me. We definitely need more election workers. And so if people go to FresnoCountyJobs.com, you can apply online. We're hiring right now. We need hundreds of workers. It is a paid job. And that's where you're actually going to learn how democracy works. And it's pretty fun and eye-opening. And so our vote centers in Fresno County, actually in the state of California, will be open for 4 days, beginning October 31st, a Saturday, Sunday, Monday, then of course, Election Day. And we will be, again, because of the COVID environment, the governor issued an executive order in May, which is telling that every active voter will receive a ballot in the mail in the state of California for the November election. It's a little bit different. Fresno County did that in March because we moved to the Voters' Choice Act. So in our county, our voters are a little bit used to that. So you'll get a ballot in the mail, and then you have to sign the back of the return envelope, because every signature on that return envelope is compared to your signature on your voter registration file. That's how we know that it was you. And so the process kind of goes on from there. And so there's a lot of safeguards in the system. It requires a lot of people to process it. We have 481,000 registered voters in Fresno County. We're looking at maybe 80% or more turnout. That's a lot of ballots. And so our office and our process is open, and you may come on down and socially distance yourself and watch how the process works.
Paul, is that similar to what you understand in terms of across the country? Because you kind of looked at this nationally, and it's citizens who are involved in counting the votes ultimately, who work for the electoral process.
Yeah, I would not say counting the votes, Andrew, but they can be engaged, work on a volunteer basis or paid basis as a poll worker. In Oregon, where we don't have polling places, there are opportunities because, as Brandi referenced, look, you know, in the California counties are, because of the Voters' Choice Act, are turning into direct mail operations. They've got a lot of paper that they need to process, and you know, you need people to process that paper. I know you may think, folks may think this is automated, but there's a lot of just face-to-face work that still needs to be done. California now has vote centers where you can get in-person services. The other thing that I think Brandi referenced that is available throughout the country is the opportunity to go in and observe the process. That's always been available so that political parties and candidates can go in, but citizens can go in as well. Perhaps the best example of this, I think, nationally, and you know, not everyone can do this, but in King County, Washington, and Brandi, I don't know if you've seen this building. You should ask your county commissioner for a building like this. But in King County, they built a new facility for their elections, and it has these large glass walls on it. And Brandi, that's how the observers get to stand in the rain. No, it's covered, but they have a way. So they didn't design it for social distance, but there's a way that people can observe the process in a very easy way. So Andrew, absolutely, there's opportunities for and requirements for observers. There's also opportunities for people to volunteer. You know, when somebody else is speaking, an image might appear on the chat, and that's going to be an image that I produced of the age of poll workers nationally. And what I like about what Brandi said is, you know, look, the vulnerable portions of the population are individuals who are 65 or older, and those constitute a majority of the poll workers nationwide. In some states, over half the poll workers are aged over 70, or they were in 2016. So we need younger people to get in there and to begin to participate and volunteer in this process. It's absolutely critical. The nightmare scenario, Andrew, that some of us are talking about in 2020 is not vote by mail, it's in person. It's that we have COVID outbreaks in certain parts of the country and in-person voting closes down. And one way to make sure that doesn't happen is we have younger folks who are volunteering or working as poll workers who are willing to go and be at the polls. And we're not relying on 75-year-olds who are much more vulnerable and may feel uncertain about going and working on November 3rd.
Well, since you mentioned the vote by mail issue, opportunity, possibility, would you guys want to inform us a little bit about what's going on with vote by mail and how, and some of, you know, this has been a little bit controversial, issues about the post office and so on. So let's move it in that direction, talk a little bit more about vote by mail. Huh?
Sure, I'll give you a national overview and then hand it off to Lisa and to Brandi. So nationally, you know, there are 34, so I've done this a number of times. I apologize to those of you, this may sound partisan. I don't think it is. There's a lot of misinformation coming out of the White House regarding vote by mail in the country. The number of states that are full vote by mail are 5, and then there are 4 more states, including California, that are going to be sending ballots to every registered voter. That is not 80 million unsolicited ballots. President Trump is incorrect about that. And in California, for example, where 70% of people have voted absentee already, California is well set up for this. But we are going to be seeing dramatic increases in the use of no excuse absentee ballots throughout the country. The estimates in Pennsylvania, it may go up by 10 times, from 5% to 50%, in Wisconsin and Ohio and in Michigan. So there's a very dramatic increase in individuals who are choosing to solicit and return a no excuse absentee ballot. Brandi knows about this, Lisa knows about this. This puts a whole new process in place for these officials, and those processes aren't invented overnight. So vote by mail is going to increase dramatically. The messaging that we have to send out nationwide is that voters have to request and return those absentee ballots on a timely basis. And given the potential flow and potential slowdowns in the postal system, most recommendations are try to return them a week ahead of time. And if you feel like you're not going to be able to do that, find out what your options are to return them to drop boxes or return them in person to a local office. The last thing I'll say is that, and lots of people are working on this, we got to be ready on election night. We're not going to have the final results. So we do not want to have a situation where candidates are declaring victory on election night, and then when the totals change, they're charging malfeasance. That again is our nightmare scenario here. Folks in the media and citizenry need to recognize that it's going to be a while. You know what? We can wait 2 or 3 days. It's all right. The world is not going to end if we don't have the final results at 8 p.m. on election night.
Yeah, so I'll speak to vote by mail. In California, we are going to have our results basically the same time as we've always had. California has been doing vote by mail for a long time. In March of this year, 15 counties had moved towards the Voters' Choice Act, and over half of the California electorate were voting by mail. So all those numbers are moving up. It is a secure way of voting because every signature is compared to the signature on your voter registration card. That does not happen at your in-person locations. So there's that part of it. When we did the March election, over 80% of the folks that voted did so by mail or by drop box. And so with COVID, I know those numbers are going to rise, and we hope they do actually, because no one should have to risk their health in order to cast a ballot. And so the process is safe and secure. And we have been working with the postal officials throughout the state of California for several months now. Also our local postal officials. They say they're up for the challenge. It's what they do. They're ready to handle the volume. I can't speak to the other states. California's been doing vote by mail for a really long time. So we have our processes in place. I do have some equipment that helps me move the volume along. There still is a lot of handwork to be done. But other states, I'm afraid, who are kind of moving to this mail voting, they have challenges. And I'm sure they've been working feverishly to try to figure out these processes and learn from other states or counties about how to, get that volume through. And so in California, what happens is we process, in Fresno County, we process all the ballots that I've received to that Monday before the election. I push out those results about 8:02 p.m. election night. Then all of my vote centers come in and I upload those. At the same time that night, staff is pulling in all of the ballots that were returned by mail, by drop box at the vote center. The next morning, I put out on our website exactly how many more live ballots I have to process. And we just start right at it Wednesday morning, and every ballot gets treated in the exact same manner as before the election. All the signatures are compared, and we get all that volume through. In California, once we finish processing the live ballots, then we have to go into a manual audit process, and we must finish that within 30 days after the election. So in California, that's really not going to change. It's what the electorate and our folks have come to know as far as timing.
So
Lisa?
I was gonna, if I could say something, I was gonna go back to our questions about trust and confidence in the system. And so I think Paul brought up a good point about not knowing the results on election night. I think that with the increase in vote by mail nationwide, that's a really important thing that needs to be reiterated and repeated and if we could train the journalists and TV personalities to say, we don't need to call the election right now. We're not going to know the results right now. I mean, I think that that's the new normal, and people need to just start to understand that that's the new normal. I was asked by a reporter if I thought that this election would change the way, because of COVID and social distancing, the way elections work in the future. I said, I don't think it'll change campaigning, but I think that once people experience the ease of vote by mail, having your ballot there, being able to research the races, being able to drop your ballot off in person or mail it through the mail, that we are probably, I expect, nationwide going to see an increase in the number of people who want to use that as their mode of voting. And so I do expect that that will happen. But I think that one other thing we need to be aware of is that voting by mail generates the lowest level of confidence among voters. So when people vote by mail, they really like it. They like the convenience aspect of it, but it also leaves a question in their mind about if their ballot got counted. And so I think that in California, and I believe in Oregon, this is the case too, although not nationwide, there are ballot trackers. And so people can track their ballot and they can make sure it was received. They can make sure it was opened. And so some of the reforms that election clerks have put in place are things like having drop boxes placed throughout the city that they check every day and they pick those ballots up in person. The ability to take your ballot to a voting location and hand it off to someone in person. All of those are to try and increase confidence among the voters that your ballot really was received and really is treated like a ballot if you put it in person. But I think that putting things in the mail, and especially like Paul referenced some of the rhetoric about, or Brandi also, the post office not being prepared and that you can't trust vote by mail ballots. I think that it really plays into the fact that we already know that confidence is lower among people when they vote by mail, right? Because there's something about not knowing for sure that that ballot got counted. So that's another thing that I think we're going to have to be aware of going into this election cycle.
So,
can
Andrew,
I bring in a couple of questions
again,
from the chat here, Brandi? There's a question for you from the chat, which was it was addressed to you from Kay Birkin. What do they do about mismatched signatures? How does that happen, and how then is there a contestation process, and how does that work if there seems to be a mismatch in the signature?
Exactly. Let me just, if I can, again, I'm going to piggyback off of Lisa. In California, people should sign up for this free tracking service. You go to where'smyballot.sos.ca.gov. And when your ballot is mailed out to you, when I receive it back, when it's processed, if there's an issue with it, you all get a text or an email. It's a great way, no matter how you return your ballot, to learn about what's going on. And of course, always call your county elections official if you have a question. So signatures, fun topic. So as the quantity of mail, yeah, well, as the
Brandi.
the quantity of mail comes in, the first thing that we do is we send it down some equipment that automatically take a picture of the back of the envelope to capture the signature on that envelope electronically. And we use in Fresno County, the first layer of review is a computerized comparison program, the same program that the banking industry uses. And about 50% of the signatures are spot on, and they'll go through and then be able to be opened and counted. If the machine says, I'm not really quite sure, then we start the manual human eyes kind of process. And we have actually 3 additional layers of human eyes on it. We train our staff in handwriting analysis. We have staff that have been with us for many, many years, and they will do the highest level of the review. The signatures then are looked at. The 2 signatures pop up on the computer screen, the one from your envelope and the one from your voter registration card. And we're looking for similarities. We're looking for the slant on your signature, or do you sign above the line, below the line? Do you have curlicues? Do you have big loops? Those indicative things that say, yeah, this is the same voter. So at the first level human review, if staff still isn't comfortable, that's fine. It goes on to a higher review. the law provides for us to then go into the voter's record and look for any other official signatures that are on their registration file. And again, we're going through that same thing. The law says that we are to liberally construe in favor of the voter, and we go through that process. However, at the end of the day, there still could be some signatures that just don't compare. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that was something bad happened. It could mean that a voter registered when they were very young and now they're much older, or they had a stroke, or they broke their hand, or the husband signed for the wife, or vice versa. So what happens is in California, we're mandated to send a letter to the voter saying either A, hey, you completely forgot to sign your envelope. Here is what we call a cure letter. Sign here, return the letter to us, and your ballot will count. Or, hey, your signature does not compare, and we need you to sign this letter, and if your signature compares to your voter registration record, your ballot will count. Actually, those mismatched things are pretty low. And I think one of the steps is because we contact the voters and give them that opportunity. So from the March election, I had 200,000 people voting. And out of that, 2,500 were what we call challenged for no signature or mismatched signature. And out of that, 2,000 people returned the cure letter and their ballots were counted, and only about 500 people did not participate in that opportunity, which was like a 0.3%. So I think the mechanism of how we do our work and contact the voter really helps to keep as many ballots as possible available to be counted.
That's really useful to me as an outsider to this whole conversation. And you, the phrase that you said, to liberally interpret or favor the voter, I think that's an important principle in all of this. And so I'm wondering if maybe our political science experts can help us a little bit, because I seem to remember, like in 2000, the election, remember, if you're old enough, I don't know if our students remember this, maybe you could tell it. I mean, there's some historical problems about whether or not voters are favored or not favored. And then this might take us towards this discussion of fraud, worries about rigged elections and so on. Lisa or Paul?
Sure, I don't know if you want me to go, Paul, or you want to go. So
Why don't, Lisa, I'll let you do the voter intent. Let me just wind back to one other question in the chat, Andrew, that's related to what Brandi just addressed. There have been news reports of disallowed ballots in the primaries. These are problems. They need to be addressed. The best place if you want to review what has happened in the primaries is a website called healthyelections.org. It's a joint effort of Stanford University and MIT, and they have reports on each of the primaries. Now, the one that is getting most coverage is what happened in New York City, where they had I believe it was 300,000 ballots, perhaps 400,000, and 80,000 were rejected. Now, this is not a problem with vote by mail. This is a problem with the New York City Board of Elections. I apologize for saying that if anyone's listening from New York City, but this is they had my daughter who lives in New York sent me a picture of her absentee ballot. Brandi, I don't know if you've seen it. The ballot instructions were terrible. She didn't know where to sign it. There were lots and lots of problems. So this was not a story of vote by mail. This is a story about an election administration problem in some other states, the problems that we face in some other states, some states have rules and regulations that are allowing people to request absentee ballots just 3 days before the election. That's just not long enough. People don't realize that the mail service is slow. So there is a lot of work going on in the election administration community and their allies to communicate out to voters what the appropriate timeline is for requesting and returning of ballots. So that danger still is there, that we may have thousands and thousands of ballots that are disallowed because they arrive late, or some of the cure provisions that Brandi refers to have not been put in place in every state. We are working in these states. We're lobbying state legislatures, we're lobbying governors. Time is, of course, getting quite short. you know, thankfully, as Brandi mentioned, California is a voter intent state, which Lisa will speak to in a second. You have all of the protections in place in California, but look, there are other states where work needs to be done. We're trying to do that work. It still is a problem, but the New York example is an odd example, and the president keeps promoting it. It is not the common one. The more common one is that voters are returning their ballots too late. And they, you know, they need to figure out the timeline or use a Dropbox.
Yeah. Well, and I'll let Brandi, I mean, we can talk about the deadlines, and California is sort of unique in our, again, sort of liberal timeline in terms of when ballots, because we use what's called the received by date for ballots to be counted as opposed to the post, I mean, we use a postmark date and then it has to be received. Anyway, I'll let Brandi talk more about that. Back to voter intent. So prior to 2000, we had sort of a long period of trust in elections, and people, you know, trusted the outcomes of elections and counting. There's always disputed election outcomes because there's always close results. You know, there's some odd number of elections that result in ties each year, and people want them to go back and recount it and things like that. But 2000 stood out because, of course, everything, Florida hung in the balance and everybody was watching the election recounts. And if you weren't old enough to remember it, I'm sure you've seen pictures of the hanging chads and the dimpled chads, which were the punch card ballots that you would use a stylus to poke out a hole to indicate your vote. In an antiquated piece of equipment we don't use in the United States anymore, but it resulted in looking at lots of pictures of poll workers holding the ballots up to the light, trying to determine the voter's intent. And out of that, and this idea that it was absurd, you know, what counts as a vote and what doesn't count as a vote, a commission was formed. And that commission created what's called the Help America Vote Act. And the Help America Vote Act looked at our election equipment and said, look, we shouldn't be using antiquated equipment, not to pick on New York, but at the time of the 2000 election, some New York counties were still using lever machines from like the 1950s.
They were using those until 2012.
Yeah, well, and they were supposed to, but so there were guidelines in place about updating your equipment and not using outdated equipment. Fresno County just updated our equipment. This last election was our first election with the new equipment. Yeah, our second time, but we were also running up against a deadline, right, to update new equipment. And so, but it also set guidelines for voter intent. And the idea is that if you can reasonably determine the voter's intent, then that vote should be counted. So if, for example, somebody, you know, fills out their ballot and they white out a selection and then they mark in a new selection, if you can say, okay, they clearly made a mistake, and they reasonably you can tell that they wanted to change it to this vote, or sometimes people X out one or scribble through it. If the clerk and the clerk staff can reasonably determine the voter's intent, then they're supposed to either recreate a new ballot. They do what's called a duplicate, recreate a new ballot, so that ballot can be put through the machine and counted. But they're supposed to make every effort to make every vote count, and that's written in the law. And so there are sometimes disagreements and lawsuits over this, whether election clerks actually apply the law correctly, but that's what's written in the law, is that in our system, where you have a protection of a right to vote, if you can determine the voter intent, it needs to be counted. And so that's what we mean by intent of the voter.
You know, so there's some conversation in the world at various levels, lots of worries about either voter fraud or voter suppression. That's another related category. How worried should we be as Americans about all of those things? And, you know, this general claim that elections could be rigged, should we be worried? What's the reality, and how likely and how often does that sort of stuff happen?
If I can, I'll start. So in California, I don't think we have voter suppression because the laws of California are so pro-voter, pro-participate. You know, you're all going to get a ballot in the mail. You don't have to apply for it. We give you multiple ways, 3 or 4 ways to return the ballot. It depends on your timing. We are encouraging people right now to make a plan. How are you going to vote? Are you going to vote the one that we send you and then mail it or put it in a Dropbox? Are you going to go in person? Where are you going to go? When are you going to go? And so California may be a little bit different than other parts of the country, but I think that we definitely encourage participation by the electorate. As far as voter fraud goes, again, this is a topic and the rhetoric that comes with it that's really frustrating for election officials, because it's been studied many, many times, and the percentage of fraud nationally is, I'll let the other academic folks answer that, but very, very small. If you saw our process, if you learn about how the process works, you'll see that it's just very low in Fresno County. We have not prosecuted anyone for voter fraud. We have prosecuted folks who applied to be candidates and ended up maybe not living where they were, where they had said on their documents. So in California, I think the process kind of helps with that. But again, it's just a constant drum that we're beating, that it is a secure system. It is open for inspection. And there are processes in which the ballots will be counted.
So I'll follow up with two things. Brandi talked about voter suppression in California. And I think that actually one of the enhancements that the Voter Choice Act made is that there's even more. So I think one way that people would say there's voter suppression, or at least, you know, subtle voter suppression, is through the placement of voting locations and where those are placed in communities. So are they accessible to low-income communities, communities of color, communities where people don't have access to vehicles? And so in counties where the Voter Choice Act has been adopted, and even before, but especially in Voter Choice Act counties, there's even more guidelines in how many elements of the population that they have to look at when they're determining where to place voting locations. So there's this belief, for example, in Fresno, that North Fresno gets more voting locations than South Fresno. But under the Voter Choice Act guidelines, that's actually not true, because they look at the amount of people who already vote by mail, and North Fresno has a very high percentage of people who vote by mail. And so more locations get concentrated in places where you had more in-person turnout. And so that's another sort of step that we've seen in the law that's gone towards fighting voter suppression. That's not overt voter suppression, right? Not trying to suppress minority votes in an overt way, but that might be subtle, sort of, might be suspect, right? That this is a way that counties could subtly suppress particular voters. So we're seeing more reforms headed in a direction to protect voters rather than regressive policy. I think, speaking to fraud, that people who study election administration, political scientists, and public administration experts are completely in line with local election officials on this, that we've looked at the data, and millions and millions and millions of votes cast over years. And when you get into the particulars of it, we take that data, we match it with the Social Security, what's called the Social Security Death Master File, which has a sort of ominous name, but it's really a list of everybody who's died, and the Social Security Administration keeps track of that. And we say, you know, are dead voters really voting? And, you know, so for example, one year I ran it in New Mexico, and I looked at all the votes cast in a year, and there were 12 people who were dead who had cast a ballot, for example. But when we went back and looked at that, a lot of what happens is people receive their ballot and they sign it and they return it and then die, right? There are a couple of cases, I mean, that happens, unfortunately. And so by the time that election day happened, they had died, but they had cast their ballot legitimately as a vote by mail ballot prior to that. There were a couple of cases where a widow or widower would get a ballot and say, oh, but I knew how my spouse was going to vote, so I just filled it out and sent it in. But the thing is that the election officials, the state administrators, and the local election officials follow up on those things and check, like, why do we have this ballot? It doesn't happen for every ballot all the time. But if you think about, you know, 2 million ballots cast and there were 12, you know, dead voters, that doesn't say that there's rampant fraud going on. I think that that there's a lot of political science research that shows, I can't remember how many decimal points it goes out, but maybe Paul can remember, but it's something like 13 decimal points, right? The odds of fraud occurring that would sway an election is, you know, minuscule. And so I think that that's something that's important for people to remember. And I agree that, you know, we've tried to repeat this over and over again, that the elections are pretty safe and secure. And in a lot of places, not all places, Georgia, right? But in a lot of places, they're very transparent. There's a chain of command, there's post-election audits. Those are also public. And so there really have been so many improvements in the last 20 years at making elections more secure and protecting election integrity. So rigging elections, of course, is a different topic. So I will go ahead and let Paul talk more about rigging.
Sure. So, I've addressed this question a lot, Andrew. And so I'm going to be fairly blunt here because frankly, I'm getting a little bit tired of answering this question. Lisa summarized it well. The evidence of voter fraud in the United States is minuscule to none. One of the most common databases that is cited is the Heritage Foundation has a database of voter fraud. I encourage everyone to look at it. I just pulled up the website. They now list 1,285 cases. Sounds like a lot. Now, don't just look at the headline, dig down. Most of what they're reporting is, as Brandi said, I think it was jokingly, but no, a husband cannot sign that ballot for the spouse or the wife for the husband. That's fraud. So, virtually all of their cases are these tiny cases where one person voted double and they count it. And then we have this number thousands, but none of those turn elections. There are a couple examples where elections have been turned. These are every single one are very small localized elections where a dozen or so ballots can change things. You cannot turn a presidential election statewide. It's just not happening. What we are hearing, unfortunately, is the rhetoric from the Republican Party. Again, it's coming from one side that there is an effort to sow distrust and misinformation about our election to set up a storyline either to explain away a loss or to challenge the election results. It's extremely unfortunate. It's extremely unfortunate the Attorney General of the United States is talking about foreign entities printing ballots, which is utterly impossible. It cannot happen. So all I can say is don't believe the hype on this stuff. You're being misled. It's very unfortunate that elected officials are doing this as a campaign strategy. The last thing I'll say for Lisa's students and any student who's listening, there's a wonderful book by Alex Kazar called The Right to Vote. It's a long volume, but I think a wonderful volume. And the reason I recommend it is that political parties compete. And one of the ways they've been competing for the last 20 years is over voting laws and election laws. And that's, again, very regrettable, but that's where we are in the United States. And so just don't believe what you hear from any elected official. Apologies, Brandi, of course, but elected officials want to get reelected. And sometimes elected officials challenge results and they shouldn't because they're frustrated that they lost. So rigging, sure, we should be worried about rigging. Here's what we should be worried about. We should be worried about foreign entities sowing misinformation on social media. We should be worried about people trying to attack our voter registration systems and having somebody show up at the office, Brandi's office, and say, I'm not on the list, how come? And it turns out someone has messed around with the rep. So we have been working very hard for the last 2 years to harden these systems, but it's not vote by mail. It's not the voting process. It's other ways. And that's where we should be focusing our attention. It's the attention that we're scrutinizing on the election system is incorrect. We're shining the spotlight in the wrong place, and we're going to not pay attention to the real threat, which is folks sowing in misinformation via social media. I'm sorry to be so blunt on this, but this is a problem right now. It's 45 days away. Don't get distracted.
Well, and I was going to say to provide an example of that, and I think if Brandi didn't see this, she'll find it humorous and she can tell you why. There was a very popular meme going around Twitter and Facebook and stuff last week where a guy says, my mom in California received my vote by mail ballot in the mail today. I haven't lived in California in 12 years. This is how the election's going to be stolen, right? Now, why couldn't she have received his ballot? Because ballots don't get mailed out until October 5th, right? So there's no way that she could have already received a ballot. California isn't even allowed to mail ballots yet. So those are the kinds of misinformation campaigns that go viral. It sounds very realistic and plausible, and then people say, oh, see, this is why it doesn't work. People are getting the wrong ballots. This guy hasn't lived here in years. The voter rolls aren't clean. But in fact, that was orchestrated to create doubt in people's minds about the process, right? And it's completely fabricated because nobody has received a ballot yet. So.
Thank you, Lisa. That's a good example. And newsflash, voters are supposed to be telling elections officials when they move. That's how we keep the rolls clean. I don't have a crystal ball of where you're moving to. States don't talk to each other about voter rolls. The technology, the political will is not there. And so, come on, help us. We do everything we can to keep the voter rolls clean. We're allowed to get information from the post office who says, hey, this guy's not there anymore. There is a process in election law. We send them a postcard, you know, we handle it. But please talk to us. Tell us where you are. We'll help you.
Folks, I'm seeing we got about 10 minutes left in our hour here. I just want to invite students and whoever else is out there watching to send questions to the chat so we can have a little, you know, interaction with our audience. And there were a couple of questions I've been watching in the chat. One was about swing states. So Lisa, you kind of jokingly said, except for Georgia. So things may not be the same in other states as they are here. How worried should we be about how this is transpiring, especially given the Electoral College and so on? And then the other question was about the census. I don't know if, I think the question was sort of asking, is there any relationship between the distribution of voting sites and being counted by the census, and how important is the census in all of this? So a couple preliminary questions, and folks out there, please send some questions to the chat.
Well, I think the census is very important because it's how we know how many people we have. Although the distribution of voting sites, and Brandi can talk more about this if she wants, or whoever wants to chime in, the distribution of voting sites is based off voter registration numbers. So county clerks don't rely on the census per se in terms of how many voting locations they're going to get. That's actually written in the law. So they're required to have a certain number of physical voting locations per number of registered voters, at least in California. That's the way the law is written. Oregon, of course, doesn't have any voting centers. You know, places like Colorado don't either. But so the census wouldn't apply that way. The place the census would be most important in terms of thinking about voting in elections would be in the number of representatives the state is allocated when Congress takes the numbers and relooks at distribution of representatives. And so that's really the biggest place where I think the census would play a role. I don't know if anybody else had anything to add.
Well, I mean, swing states, it's the same concern that swing state issues are the primary concerns on the swing states is of those, I will say Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, potentially North Carolina, possibly Georgia, but unlikely. North Carolina is more of a concern in terms of election administration. The challenge, Andrew, and to the person who asked a question is not so much voter suppression efforts. You know, there's litigation going on. Folks are trying, and you know, we don't know how that litigation is going to be settled. For example, right now there's litigation going on in Pennsylvania. The Trump campaign is suing the state to try to have them remove drop boxes that they put in place for the first time in the primary and were heavily used. So, you know, the challenge in the swing states is going to be the flow of vote by mail ballots, and that those ballots aren't in yet and have not been counted because they don't have the procedures that Brandi has developed over the years. And so there's this flood of absentee ballots. And just to take one example, in Michigan, they have not yet been able to change the law or the administrative rules to allow the administrators to begin to process the absentee ballots until election day. What that means is that in Michigan, if half of the ballots come in, it's election day, and they have not even begun to go through all the steps that Brandi described. They have not yet begun. I know, you're shaking your head, exactly. They have not looked at this, it's a nightmare. They have not looked at the signatures. They haven't opened the envelopes. Curing, what do you mean curing? It's election day. So that's gonna be the challenge in the swing states. You know, on the vote suppression and the vote access efforts, you know, there's litigation ongoing. Again, Pennsylvania is an issue, North Carolina, I think Wisconsin, and I don't think there's any current litigation, but I could be wrong on that. But frankly, right now, the laws are pretty much in Wisconsin. We just had a good decision by the Supreme Court in Wisconsin that said that they don't have to reprint the ballots. That needed to be done. Kanye, sorry, you're not going to be on the ballot in Wisconsin. But apparently in California, he's on the ballot.
An American independent.
Hey, so in our last 5 minutes, I wonder, and someone asked this question in the chat too, is the question from Andrew: how can we as general people help fight against voter misinformation? So, you know, maybe you all could leave us with some words of wisdom. What can people do to get involved in this? How can we help to promote trust? Because you know, this conversation has helped reassure me that at least in Fresno County, we're doing a good job of this. So we should be proud of ourselves, I think, here. What can people do to get involved and help combat misinformation and distrust and so on? Maybe, can we maybe go from Paul to Lisa to Brandi, and that'll head us, I think, towards conclusion.
Sure. I'll be brief, Andrew. I think figure out what your trusted sources are. Don't rely on social media. Just because your friends think it's true doesn't mean it really is true. I put a hashtag in there that the National Association of Secretary of States and the National Association of State Election Directors have been promoting, hashtag TrustedInfo 2020. Go to your local election official. Brandi's got a lot of people ready to man the phones. Somebody asked a question earlier about poll workers. Can they volunteer in Fresno County? I said, email Brandi's office, they'll answer. So figure out what your trusted news sources are. And if something seems fictitious, it probably is. So just be skeptical and try to figure out what those reliable sources are.
So I was actually going to have a very similar answer, that when it comes to election, a lot of things are right there for you to go look up yourself. There's, you know, not every county clerk has the greatest website, but our Secretary of State has a really good website. The county clerk's information has a lot. Somebody mentioned the League of Women Voters in the chat. The League of Women Voters has a lot of good information about voting in elections, both nationally, and we have local chapters that have a lot of good information about that. I think that when we think about what can we do about misinformation campaigns nationally, I saw a quote, I'm sorry, I can't attribute it to who it was. I think it was a reporter. And they talked about, why do you keep pushing back against misinformation? Why do you keep calling people out on social media? You know you're never going to change their minds. And their response was, I don't necessarily put the information out there to change other people's minds. I do it so it doesn't change me, right? Which I thought was a great quote, because knowing and fostering and promoting truth is really important. And if people give up on that and stop doing it, right, you don't have people who are saying, look, that's not actually how it happens. Look, you can look at this website and you can find information here. You can call the county clerk and you can verify this for yourself. I think it's important. And I'm not saying be, you know, confrontational all the time, but I think that if we continue to try and promote truth, then maybe I'm too optimistic, I believe truth wins, right? And it's out there and it's verifiable, and I think facts are real. And so I think we all have a responsibility to try and do that. Just as easy as it is to click a funny meme that might be misinformation, it's also easy to share information that is factually accurate.
Thank you. And, you know, I mirror both of your comments. Is social media is too easy to just say anything anyone wants, whether it is true or false. And that is, for elections officials, very difficult to combat with the truth. And we constantly try to do that. So as elections officials, we send voters a lot of information directly to their home. I've already mailed out 2 postcards to every single voter. Hey, this is how the election's going to be. This is how many days we're going to be open. Here are your options. In about a week, every voter will be mailed a voter information guide from Fresno County, if you live in our county. And we labor over that 50-page booklet over every single word to make sure that we're giving you the most accurate, easily understandable information to have you make an educated decision about how you're going to vote and where you go and how you make a plan. And get involved. If you really want to know and you want to get paid, then be a vote center worker. I mean, again, FresnoCountyJobs.com, you can apply online. You can come and observe our processes. I think the biggest thing is, well, one of the things that really frustrates me is a voter who has some sort of problem, no matter what it is, will go to social media first and complain that it's all wrong instead of just picking up the phone and calling me. We want to help you. We want it to be right. We want to make sure all eligible voters can participate. So give us a call, give us an email. We can help you. So that's my parting words.
I know, can I say one more thing? I know we're out of time, but I want to tell the college students watching and young people watching, if you grew up in California and you've always received a voter guide in your house, or if this is your first election and you didn't know you get a voter guide, don't take those for granted. I moved here from a state that does not get voter guides. They don't create them. It has a lot of information about the propositions that are going to be on the ballot. We have several propositions this year. It has information about local candidates. Candidates can send in their own bios. The League of Women Voters often does a nonpartisan pro-con about the different propositions in there. And so it's very useful information. And don't take it for granted, because you pay for it as taxpayers, right? But it's a benefit to us as voters, and not every state does that, and not every county does it.
So I think we need to bring this to a close, and I just want to thank our speakers, Dr. Paul Gronke from Reed College in Oregon. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. We'll give you a round of applause. And Professor Lisa Bryant from the Political Science Department at Fresno State. Thank you. We'll give you a round of applause. And Brandi Orth, our County Clerk and Registrar of Voters here in Fresno County. If you're interested in this kind of thing, the Ethics Center at Fresno State has been sponsoring and hosting this stuff for over 10 years, these kind of conversations. And now we're trying to develop our presence online in virtual reality. So please follow us on Facebook and all of that stuff. Although, as our expert said, don't believe everything you read on Facebook and social media. But anyway, thank you again. Very, very important topic. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed that everything unfolds in a good way in the next few months.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brandi. Good luck, everybody.
Yeah, you too.